Welcome to this journey through one of the most baffling disappearances in Pacific Northwest history. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will haunt you in a way few other accounts can. We're about to delve into a mystery that consumed an entire logging community, where 15 men vanished without a trace on a single winter night in 1947, leaving behind a legacy so disturbing that the logging company tried to erase every record of their existence. It was the year 1947. The world was recovering from the devastation of World War II. In America, veterans were returning home, seeking work in the booming timber industry. In the mountains of northern Washington state, along the Canadian border, the situation was different. These ancient forests held secrets that predated modern civilization, and in their shadows, men disappeared. The Olympic Peninsula had always been a place of extremes. Dense forests where Douglas firs grew 300 feet tall. Rainfall that exceeded 140 inches per year in some valleys. Winters so harsh that logging camps became islands of civilization surrounded by impassable wilderness. And in the winter of 1947, one of those camps became the site of an unexplained tragedy that authorities would spend decades trying to understand. The Cascade Lumber Company operated Camp 12 in a remote valley 40 miles from the nearest town of Granite Falls. To call it isolated would be an understatement. The camp existed at the end of a logging road that twisted through old-growth forest so thick that daylight barely penetrated the canopy even at noon. During summer months, supply trucks could make the journey in 3 hours. During winter, when snow closed the high passes and turned the road into a ribbon of ice, the camp was cut off completely for weeks at a time. There, in those distant mountains, where the outside world seemed to exist in another dimension, 73 men lived and worked in conditions that would seem medieval by modern standards. They woke before dawn in unheated bunkhouses. They worked 12-hour shifts in temperatures that regularly dropped below zero. They felled trees that had stood for 500 years, using crosscut saws and axes and sheer physical strength. And when darkness fell at 4 in the afternoon during those short winter days, they retreated to the dining hall and bunkhouses, smoking cigarettes and playing cards and trying to forget how far they were from everything they knew. The camp itself was a collection of rough, hewn buildings clustered in a clearing carved from the forest. The main bunkhouse was a long structure with a corrugated metal roof that drummed constantly with rain or snow. Inside, 2 rows of narrow bunks lined the walls, separated by a central aisle where a potbelly stove provided inadequate heat. The men slept in their work clothes, under wool blankets that smelled of wood smoke and sweat, and the distinctive scent of Douglas fir sap that permeated everything in a logging camp. Adjacent to the bunkhouse stood the dining hall, a larger building where Cookie Morrison, a 58-year-old former Navy cook, served 3 meals a day to the crew. Breakfast was at 4:30 in the morning. Oatmeal, fried eggs, bacon, and coffee so strong it could strip paint. Lunch was delivered to the work sites in metal pails. Dinner was served at 6, roast meat, potatoes, canned vegetables, and thick slabs of bread. The food was plain but abundant. A logging camp crew consumed an average of 5,000 calories per day per man. Hunger was not a problem. Other things were. The camp foreman was a man named Elias Drummond, 49 years old, with 3 decades of logging experience etched into every scar on his hands. He ran Camp 12 with military precision. Work crews assembled at 5 in the morning. Equipment was maintained religiously. Safety protocols were enforced with iron discipline. Under Drummond's watch, Camp 12 had one of the best safety records in the company. In 3 years of operation, They'd had only 2 serious injuries, no fatalities, until that winter. The crew at Camp 12 was a mixture of types, as all logging camps were. There were veterans, men who'd survived Normandy and Iwo Jima, and come home to find that the only work they could get involved risking their lives in a different way. There were farm boys from the Midwest, seeking adventure and wages that seemed impossibly high compared to what they could earn behind a plow. There were drifters, men with no ties to anywhere, who moved from camp to camp following the work. And there were a few family men, loggers who'd been in the woods since they were teenagers, who returned to their wives and children in Granite Falls every few months with paychecks that kept their families fed through another season. The winter of 1946 to 1947 was particularly brutal. Snow began falling in October, 2 weeks earlier than normal. By November, the camp was buried under 6 feet of accumulation. The logging road became impassable. The last supply truck made it through on November 23rd, carrying provisions that would have to last until the spring thaw. After that, Camp 12 was alone. The first strange occurrence happened on December 8th. Tommy Bridger, a 24-year-old faller from Oregon, failed to show up for his shift. This was unusual. In a logging camp, tardiness wasn't tolerated. The work was too dangerous, too dependent on coordination between crews. When Drummond went to the bunkhouse to rouse Bridger, he found the young man's bunk empty. Not just empty, stripped. The blankets were folded neatly. Bridger's personal effects, which had been stored in a wooden crate beneath the bunk, were gone. "Looks like he packed up and left," said Charlie Moss, the bull bucker who supervised the falling crews. Maybe he got homesick, but that explanation made no sense. The camp was 40 miles from the nearest town, through deep snow and dense forest. The temperature was hovering around 10 degrees Fahrenheit. No one in their right mind would attempt that journey on foot, especially not in December darkness. Drummond organized a search. 20 men spread out through the camp and the immediate vicinity, calling Bridger's name, checking the equipment sheds and the timber stands where they'd been working. They found nothing, no tracks leading away from camp, no sign of struggle, no body. Maybe he fell in the river, someone suggested. A fast, moving creek ran along the eastern edge of camp, swollen with snowmelt, could have slipped on the ice. They searched the creek banks for 2 days. Nothing. Tommy Bridger had simply ceased to exist. The incident disturbed the camp, but life continued. Logging crews had quotas to meet. Trees had to be felled, limbed, and hauled to the loading area. The work was too demanding, too all-consuming, to allow much time for speculation. Within a week, Bridger's disappearance had become one of those mysteries that men discussed over cigarettes after dinner, but no longer obsessed over. Then, on December 22nd, 2 more men vanished. Frank Silva and Pete Jacobson were both choker setters, young men whose job was to wrap steel cables around felled logs so they could be dragged to the loading area by the steam donkey. They were last seen at dinner on the 21st. Charlie Moss remembered them eating quickly, complaining about the cold, talking about how they'd spend their wages when they got back to civilization. They went to the bunkhouse after dinner. The next morning, their bunks were empty, stripped clean, personal effects gone. This time, the camp didn't accept the easy explanations. Drummond called an emergency meeting in the dining hall that evening. 70 men crowded into the space, their faces grim in the lamplight. The potbelly stove roared, but the room still felt cold. "I know what you're thinking," Drummond said, standing at the front of the hall. His voice carried the authority of decades in the woods. 3 men don't just walk off into the wilderness in the middle of winter. Something's wrong here. Could be they got killed. Someone said from the back. Murder? By who? Drummond shot back. We're 40 miles from anywhere. We're the only people out here. Maybe not, said Cookie Morrison, the old Navy cook. He was standing near the stove, arms crossed over his barrel chest. These mountains have always been strange. The Indians wouldn't come up into these valleys. They had stories about things in the deep woods. Several men laughed nervously. Others didn't laugh at all. We're not dealing with ghosts, Drummond said firmly. We're dealing with facts. 3 men are missing. We need to find out what happened to them. He organized another search, more thorough this time. Crews combed through every building, every equipment shed, every section of forest within a quarter-mile of camp. They searched the creek again. They climbed the ridge behind camp and scanned the valley with binoculars. They found nothing, no bodies, no blood, no tracks leading away. It was as if Silva and Jacobson had evaporated. The atmosphere in Camp 12 changed after that. Men started keeping watch at night, taking turns sitting up in the bunkhouse with lanterns burning. Conversations became quieter, more guarded. Some of the crew wanted to abandon the camp, to risk the 40-mile hike to Granite Falls despite the weather. Drummond forbade it. We stay together, he said. We keep working. When the road opens in spring, we'll get answers. But spring was 3 months away. The night of January 17, 1947, started like any other. Dinner was beef stew, thick and salty, served with cornbread and canned peaches. The men ate in relative silence. Outside, a storm was building. Wind howled through the valley, making the buildings creak and groan. Snow fell in horizontal sheets, accumulating rapidly. The temperature was dropping. After dinner, most of the crew returned to the bunkhouse. Some played cards. Others wrote letters they wouldn't be able to mail for months. A few men stood near the stove, smoking and talking in low voices about home, about spring, about whether they'd return to Camp 12 next season. Around 8 o'clock, the lights flickered. The camp's generator, housed in a small shed behind the dining hall, was temperamental in the best conditions. In a storm like this, it was a miracle it worked at all. Better get the lanterns ready, someone said. We're gonna lose power. They were right. At 8:43, according to Drummond's pocket watch, the lights went out completely. The bunkhouse plunged into darkness. Men cursed and fumbled for matches. Lanterns were lit, casting weak circles of yellow light that made the shadows seem deeper. The wind outside grew louder, a constant roar punctuated by crashes as tree branches gave way under the weight of snow. This was when things became confused. Later, when investigators tried to piece together what happened, they encountered contradictory testimonies, gaps in memory, the fog of fear that settled over Camp 12 that night. What is known for certain is this. At approximately 9:15, someone noticed that the far end of the bunkhouse was quieter than it should be. The 15 bunks along the east wall, where Silva and Jacobson had slept before they vanished, had been reassigned to other crew members. Those 15 men should have been there, talking, smoking, preparing for sleep. They weren't. Hey! A logger named Walter Price called out. Where's Danny? Where's Hicks? Silence from the east end. Price grabbed a lantern and walked down the center aisle. The light revealed 15 empty bunks, not just empty stripped, blankets folded, personal crates gone. It was exactly like the previous disappearances, except this time it wasn't 1 or 2 men. It was 15. Chaos erupted. Men shouted, grabbing lanterns and rushing to the east end, confirming what Price had seen. 15 men gone, vanished. The bunkhouse door was closed and latched from the inside. The windows were shuttered against the storm. No one had seen anyone leave. No one had heard anything unusual over the howl of the wind. Drummond was fetched from his private cabin. He arrived at the bunkhouse within minutes, his face set in grim lines. He examined the empty bunks, checked the door, questioned everyone present. "When did you last see them?" he demanded. The answers varied. Some men remembered seeing the missing crew members after dinner. Others couldn't remember seeing them at all. The confusion of the power outage, the darkness, the storm, it all blurred together. "We search now," Drummond said. "Everyone, every building, every inch of this camp." They searched through the night. In howling wind and driving snow, with lanterns that cast more shadow than light, 8 men scoured Camp 12. They checked the dining hall, the equipment sheds, the generator house, the latrines. They searched the forest at the camp's perimeter, calling names into the darkness. They checked the creek, though it was partially frozen now, treacherous with ice. Nothing. 15 men had vanished without a trace. As dawn broke gray and weak through the storm, Drummond called another meeting. The remaining crew crowded into the dining hall, their faces hollow with exhaustion and fear. Cookie Morrison served coffee that no one really tasted. "This is what we know," Drummond said, his voice hoarse from shouting names into the storm. 15 men are gone. They disappeared sometime between 8:30 and 9:15 last night. They took their personal belongings. They left no tracks, no signs of struggle. "It's not human," someone whispered. "No human could take 15 men without anyone seeing or hearing." "We need to leave," another voice said. "We need to get out of here now." The storm's still going. Drummond said, "We'd die in the woods before we made it 5 miles. We'll die here too." The man shot back. Drummond had no answer for that. The next 3 days were a nightmare of fear and paranoia. The remaining crew slept in shifts, keeping lanterns burning constantly. Some men refused to let their personal belongings out of sight. Others packed their gear and kept it near the door, ready to flee at the first opportunity. The storm finally broke on January 20th. The sky cleared, revealing a landscape transformed by 3 feet of new snow. The camp was buried. The logging road was invisible under pristine white. And still, there was no sign of the missing men. Drummond made the decision to send runners to Granite Falls. 5 of his strongest men, equipped with snowshoes and emergency supplies, would make the 40-mile journey to bring back help. It was risky, but staying seemed riskier. The runners departed at first light on January 21st. They were led by Charlie Moss, the bull bucker, who knew the route better than anyone. The remaining crew watched them disappear into the forest, small figures moving through a white wilderness. The runners reached Granite Falls 3 days later, on January 24th. They stumbled into town exhausted, half frozen, barely coherent. Their story seemed impossible. 18 men missing, an entire crew terrorized, something evil in the woods. The Snohomish County Sheriff, a man named Robert Talbot, organized a rescue party immediately. 20 volunteers, equipped with medical supplies and weapons, made the journey to Camp 12. With them came 2 investigators from the Cascade Lumber Company headquarters and a reporter from the Everett Herald, who smelled a sensational story. They reached the camp on January 27th, 10 days after the main disappearance. What they found disturbed them deeply. The remaining crew was on the verge of psychological collapse. Men who'd survived combat in the Pacific Theater, who'd faced death in a dozen forms, were jumping at shadows. They'd barricaded themselves in the dining hall, refusing to sleep in the bunkhouse. They'd stopped working. The camp had descended into primal fear. Sheriff Talbot took control immediately. He interviewed every man individually, recording their testimonies in a notebook that would later become part of the official record. The stories were consistent in their essential facts, but varied wildly in interpretation. Some men believed they were dealing with a serial killer, someone who'd been living in the woods, picking off loggers one by one. Others believed something supernatural was responsible: spirits, demons, creatures from Indian legend. The investigators searched the camp systematically. They examined the bunkhouse, measuring distances, checking sight lines, looking for trapdoors or hidden passages. They found nothing. The building was solid, simple, unremarkable. There was no way 15 men could have left without being seen or heard. They searched the surrounding forest, forming lines and moving through the snow in careful grids. They were looking for bodies now. 18 men couldn't simply cease to exist. There had to be remains somewhere. On the third day of searching, February 1st, they found something. About 2 miles from camp, in a dense stand of old-growth cedar, one of the search parties discovered marks in the snow. Not footprints, the snow had been undisturbed for days, but gouges in the bark of several massive trees, as if something heavy had scraped against them. And at the base of one cedar, partially hidden by a root ball, they found a single item: a wool cap frozen stiff, dark with what might have been blood. The cap was identified as belonging to Ray Hicks, one of the 15 men who disappeared on January 17th. The discovery galvanized the search. Crews focused on that area, convinced they were close to finding bodies. They searched for 5 more days, expanding the radius, checking every hollow tree and snow-covered depression. They found nothing else, just that single cap, sitting like a marker at the base of a cedar tree that had stood for 800 years. The official investigation lasted 6 weeks. Sheriff Talbot interviewed hundreds of people. He examined Camp 12 from every angle. He consulted with experts in forestry, wildlife behavior, meteorology. He pursued every theory, no matter how implausible. His final report, filed on March 15, 1947, concluded that 18 men had disappeared under circumstances that could not be satisfactorily explained. The report noted that there was no evidence of foul play, no evidence of animal attack, no evidence of avalanche or natural disaster. The men had simply vanished. The Cascade Lumber Company closed Camp 12 permanently. The buildings were dismantled and the equipment removed. Within 6 months, there was no trace that a camp had ever existed in that remote valley. The company refused to comment publicly on the incident, and they sealed all internal documents related to Camp 12. Officially, the disappearances never happened, but stories persisted. Some of the surviving crew members gave interviews to newspapers. Their accounts varied wildly. Some stuck to the facts, describing the disappearances in clinical detail. Others added embellishments: strange sounds in the woods, unexplained lights, the feeling of being watched. The story took on mythic qualities, mutating with each retelling. In 1963, 16 years after the disappearances, a pair of hikers exploring the Cascade backcountry stumbled upon something strange. In a remote valley that matched the general location of Camp 12, they found a small cluster of weathered wooden crosses planted in the ground. There were 18 crosses, each marked with initials carved deep into the wood. The hikers reported their find to the Forest Service, but by the time rangers reached the site 3 weeks later, the crosses were gone. Whether they'd been removed by someone or destroyed by weather, no one could say. In 1978, a researcher from the University of Washington named Dr. Ellen Marsh conducted an extensive study of unexplained disappearances in the Pacific Northwest. Her work, published in the Journal of Forestry History, included a chapter on Camp 12. Dr. Marsh tracked down 12 of the surviving crew members and interviewed them at length. Their testimonies, recorded 31 years after the events, were remarkably consistent on the basic facts, but revealed deep psychological scars. Several men reported nightmares that had persisted for decades. One admitted he'd never been able to sleep in complete darkness again. Dr. Marsh's conclusion was cautious but troubling. She noted that the disappearances at Camp 12 shared characteristics with other unexplained vanishings in remote wilderness areas. The absence of bodies, the lack of tracks, the feeling of uncanny wrongness reported by survivors. She stopped short of proposing any definitive explanation, but her work raised questions that remain unanswered. What happened to those 18 men? The rational explanations have always been inadequate. The theory that they were murdered requires a killer of almost supernatural skill, someone who could abduct 15 men simultaneously from a locked bunkhouse without leaving a trace. The theory that they fled into the wilderness voluntarily requires accepting that 18 men, many of them experienced woodsmen, would choose to walk 40 miles through a blizzard rather than wait for spring. Neither scenario makes sense. Other theories are more disturbing. There are stories among the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest about places in the deep forest where the boundary between worlds grows thin, where people can slip through into somewhere else. The Lummi Nation, whose traditional lands include the Cascade foothills, have legends about the ghost forests as sections of old-growth timber where even animals refuse to go. Could Camp 12 have been built in such a place? Could the men have encountered something that exists outside our normal understanding of reality? The story of Camp 12 remains a disturbing reminder that there are still mysteries in our world, places where the rational and the inexplicable collide. These mountains, these ancient forests, hold secrets that may never be fully understood. 18 men learned that truth firsthand in the winter of 1947, in a remote valley that has since returned to wilderness. But questions remain. If you visit the Cascade Mountains today, if you hike far enough from the maintained trails, you might find yourself in valleys that feel somehow different, quieter, darker, older. You might find weathered stumps from old logging operations, remnants of an industry that once dominated these forests. And if you're unlucky, you might find yourself wondering if you're truly alone. To this day, loggers working in the remote reaches of the Cascades sometimes report strange phenomena. Tools that go missing from locked sheds, camps where the wildlife seems unnaturally absent. And on certain winter nights, when the wind howls through the valleys and the temperature drops below zero, some claim to hear voices in the darkness, the voices of men calling for help, their words swallowed by the forest before anyone can respond. The families of the 18 missing men never received closure. Tommy Bridger's mother waited until 1960, one for him to come home. Frank Silva's wife remarried in 1950, but kept her first husband's name until she died. Ray Hicks' wool cap, found at the base of that ancient cedar, remained in police evidence for 30 years before being incinerated in a station house fire. The physical traces of these men faded, but the mystery endures. If this journey through one of the most baffling disappearances in American history resonated with you, if you find yourself pondering the thin line between the known and the unknowable, then consider subscribing to this channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, mysteries buried in time that deserve to be examined. Leave a like if this account provoked reflections that go beyond mere entertainment, and comment sharing your own perspectives on what might truly happen in the remote places of our world, where civilization's light grows dim. Until next time, remember that some mysteries refuse to be solved, and some questions are more important than their answers.